Graham Addison here again at Gourdlandia with another how-to video, and today I'll be talking about finishing the gourd, how you put stain or wax, how I put stain and wax on a gourd. First of all, I want to step back and say, do you really need to finish a gourd? Sometimes people think that if they don't put something on the surface that the gourd might rot, and hopefully if you've seen my other videos you know that that's not true. You really don't need to put anything on the gourd. A lot of people just like to use the gourd in its natural, well, this is cleaned actually, but in a natural unfinished state, and that's perfectly fine. I like to shine them up a little bit before I start making artwork, and also to add some color to the gourd, because these are the color of the raw gourd is just not quite deep enough to my liking. So the first step is to wash the gourd really well and make sure you don't have any little flecks of skin still left on the gourd, and I showed about that in a previous video. But it's important, if you're going to put a stain on the gourd, that that you don't have any little flecks of skin, because it won't stain the same way. So I'm going to show you my technique, but I want to just say that there's no right or wrong way to do this. Gourd artists are largely self-taught, and I certainly don't want to get in the way of anybody's experimenting. So just because I do it this way doesn't mean you shouldn't do it some other way. A lot of gourd artists use alcohol inks and spray varnishes. That's not my style for several reasons. But really, once the gourd is dried, the shell behaves very much like wood. So anything you could do to wood in terms of finishes will work. You could use, people use leather dyes, or various varnishes, paint, of course, colored pencil. You can use Minwax. There's all kinds of products. Anything that you might use on a piece of wood, you could experiment with on a gourd. I like to use these inks. It's a water-based ink. The brand is Memories, and I get them at Blue Whale Arts, but you can get a similar thing at Wellburn, or there's various places. But what it is it's a stamp pad refill. I find it easier to get a non-streaky finish than with the alcohol inks. That's my personal preference, is to use these. And then the wax that I use is actually in the form of shoe polish, and I'll show you that in just a second. When I first started with gourd art, I was using a leather dye and linseed oil, and that just took a long time for the oil to dry, and I got impatient. So I'd always start working on my gourd before it was really ready, and my clothes became completely stained with linseed oil and leather dye. And then I noticed after a while that the leather dye actually faded pretty easily. So anyway, I did some research and came up with this technique that goes pretty quickly. I was looking for something we could do quickly in classes, anyway, so I really like this. I use it all the time, not just in classes. For the longest time, I just used brown, straight brown. I'll show you what it looks like. I'm using just pieces of felt cut up. Some people use makeup applicators. For years, I was satisfied with brown straight out of the bottle, and then one day I said, that's too orange. So I started adding some green, and now I use, this is olive, they call it. I use pretty much half and half-ish combination of brown and olive. I'll mix it up till I get just pretty much what I want, and then spread it over the gourd like that. You can't make it darker by leaving it on thicker or something like that. You're going to wipe off the excess. So one thing I really like about using this ink is that the modeling of the gourd shows through really nicely. It's still looking a little bit orangey to me, so I'm going to add more green. It's really, I find it to be very forgiving. If you don't like what you're doing, you can change it without too much. You know, you can just add more. I find it pretty easy to work with. And a little bottle goes a long way. It lasts me weeks, and I'm doing a lot of gourd art with one little bottle. Don't forget the stem. And the bottom of the gourd. So I like to finish the gourd before I start doing any artwork on it, like cutting into it. I find it's just nice to finish the gourd when it doesn't have any openings. And also, if you are cutting into, so say I'm making a bowl, and I make the bowl, the cutout first, and then I'm staining and waxing, I'm going to smudge the inside of it up. And that's fine if you're going to like paint it black or something, which a lot of people do, but I like just the natural color of the inside of the gourd. All right, so I've got it more or less a color that I like. It's plausible on a gourd, which is one of the things that I like to aim for. Colors that kind of look like they could actually happen on a gourd. And then I'm going to take a rag and wipe off all the excess. And the next thing I'm going to do is heat the gourd up to heat set the ink. Well, that sounds pretty fancy, but basically I'm just drying the ink and making the gourd warm. Do you have to do that? I was told at first that you do, and then somebody said, no, you don't really need to do that. I like to heat it up because I find it does quicken the drying, but also I like to get the gourd really nice and hot for the next step. So you'll see that. So I'm using this, it's like a paint stripping tool, and it gets really hot, so you have to be careful that you don't burn yourself, you don't burn the cord, and you don't char the gourd. You could potentially char the gourd. You could use a hair dryer, but I think it would take a lot longer. So, and in the summertime, I use a solar oven for this. I just put it in the oven for a little while in the sun. And so a gourd this size is going to take maybe 3 or 4 minutes to dry the ink and get it good and hot for the waxing step. I see people do this. That's not going to do it. You have to be right in close, like an inch or so away from the gourd to really get it good and hot. And you got to keep it moving so that you don't scorch the gourd. And you want to be really aware of your hand. Sometimes I take my glove off of the other hand so I'm aware of if it's getting hot or not. Alright, so that's looking pretty good. And now, quickly, before it gets cold, I'm going to do the next step. I'm going to be using shoe polish. So this is just your standard drugstore Kiwi brand shoe polish. I usually stick with the neutral color, which doesn't add any pigment. You don't want to use a lot. That's the key with this part of the process is like a gourd this size, maybe see just a smear of this shoe polish. It's not much at all, less than a quarter teaspoon. And you want to, like I said, put it on pretty hot. And the reason for that is then you'll get a really thin coat. This is one of those less is more situations. Because if you use too much, if the coat of wax is too thick, then it might, your gourd kind of will stay tacky. Nobody wants a tacky gourd. So it's still nice and warm. So I'm just going to show you that you could, if you want, sometimes I add darker shoe polish just to add a little bit of pigment. Let's say I look at it and I think, oh, it needs a little bit more. Then you could add just a little bit of the darker shoe polish at this point, and it'll darken your gourd up a little bit. Generally, I stay with the neutral because I usually like to just get the color right by the ink alone. So the thing about shoe polish is, well, it's obviously got some pigment in it, and it's got dryers in it. That's why it smells bad, and you want to keep the windows open, or at least have some ventilation while you're doing this. But it's primarily wax. It's paraffin and carnauba wax. So and I just like the wax finish. So as soon as this gourd is no longer warm to the touch, I'll be able to buff it up, shine it up a little bit, and then I'll show you the next step. All right, the gourd has cooled and I have regrouped, and we're ready to go to the next step. So, the next step is to put on a little bit of shoe cream, which is similar to shoe polish, but it's creamier. It's not as solid. I don't heat the gourd up for that. If you heat the gourd after you have the shoe polish on it, it's just not, you don't need to do it, and it's not good. It smells really bad. You don't want to do that. So, but before I put the next step of wax, the next layer of wax on it, I want to buff the gourd really well. I use a rag that's got a little bit more texture than most of my rags, and that I just feel like that does a good job of the buffing. So what that does, it shines takes the wax layer that's on there and shines it up when you, I don't really know if this is what's happening, but this is what I imagine is happening. You put the first coat of wax on, it's just kind of amorphous, and then you shine it up, and instead of, like microscopically, instead of being disorganized, you're making it into like plates or scales, right? It's becoming, that's why it's shiny. And then when you put the second coat on, it fills in those like little cracks between the scales. You don't need much at all. So what I'm saying is, if you just put the second coat of wax on now before buffing, I feel like you're kind of wasting time. It's not going to really help as much at all. Let me just say a word about the gloves that I use. I like these gloves. I'm not sure they're marketed for men, but they're really good because I can use the same pair of gloves for like a month before it breaks, and so I'm not using too many gloves. And also, I tried the dishwashing gloves. You know what I'm talking about? They're thicker. They've got a texture on them. It's hard to do what I'm doing without getting that texture onto the gourd. So anyway, these are good gloves. And so the shoe cream is Meltonian. That's the brand that I like to use. They were out of business for a while, but you can get their product now. It doesn't matter what color, hardly matters what color. I use one that's like not too distant from what I'm trying to get, but it hardly adds any pigment is what I'm saying. So don't worry too much about the color. And see, also a very tiny amount. You don't want a lot because you don't want your gourd to be tacky. Now when I'm putting it on, check this out. I'm not just doing this. It dries pretty quickly. So I'm putting it on. I'm using my whole hand and getting all the parts. Like I said, it dries really quickly. So by the time I finish putting it on, I hardly have to wait any time, maybe half a minute or so, but really you can pretty much buff it right away. Just a nice light touch when you're buffing. Now, to me, that's pretty good. I'm like ready to make a lamp. Once in a while, I use a second coat of Meltonian, but generally one is good enough. So that's my process. Oh, I did want to say, if you notice scratches on your gourd after staining it, that's because it was a gourd probably that didn't have enough time on the vine. I mentioned this in the video about washing gourds, and so a gourd that is well grown and has had plenty of time on the vine, you can wash it, and then when you put the stain on it, you don't see any little scratches. So that's what I do, and I'd be interested to hear what you do. All right, thanks.